Has Zimbabwe's President Robert Mugabe been ousted from power? Soldiers surround government buildings, but the military denies it's a coup. I'm Imran Gata, and today's newsmaker is the military takeover in Harare. It began like so many coups have, with a military commander taking control of a TV station and reading a statement to assure viewers that the president and his family are safe. Since then, the rumor mill has churned out one major allegation after another: that Mugabe might be dead, that he and his wife are in custody, that the First Lady has been ordered to leave the country. As for the military, it denies a coup has taken place, saying the 93-year-old leader is being protected from criminals. One thing is for certain: the army, amid gunfire and explosions, took power on Wednesday. And a country plagued by corruption and rampant inflation is facing an upheaval unmatched in decades. We begin our debate with this report from Sandra Gatman.
There were early signs the military was taking over. Tanks and armed soldiers deployed across the capital, Harare. And soon, the state TV station was hijacked by soldiers. It looked like a coup, but they denied it.
We are only targeting criminals around him who are committing crimes that are causing social and economic suffering in the country in order to bring them to justice.
The people accused of crimes are members of a political elite the army says are responsible for deposing Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa. The army's actions were sparked by a power struggle within the ruling party, ZANU-PF, over who will succeed President Robert Mugabe. There are two factions. One is known as Lacoste, the nickname for Mnangagwa, who had the support of the army and war veterans from the Liberation War. The other is known as Generation 40, led by Mugabe's wife Grace, who's also the head of the powerful Women's League. But last week, Mnangagwa was fired and expelled from the party, accused by Grace Mugabe of trying to overthrow the president.
Mnangagwa tried to topple the president through a coup. He actually tried to wrestle power from the president. I have the evidence.
Zimbabwe's defense forces, on the other hand, accuse Grace Mugabe loyalists of trying to seize the throne for themselves. When I visited Harare last month, the War Veterans Association told me they want Mugabe's successor to have revolutionary roots.
There are people who have opportunities or access to resources, and they will amass that wealth. I have a legacy to protect. I went to war, I fought the war, I won the war, and my people must benefit.
What's unclear is where Zimbabwe goes from here. Several ministers were detained, and President Robert Mugabe was put under house arrest. But world leaders are urging the army not to go further.
I am hoping that the defense force will not move and do more damage, that they will be able to respect the constitution of Zimbabwe as well as the people of Zimbabwe.
While the streets of Harare were calm in the immediate aftermath of military action, the nation was on edge. Could this be the beginning of the end of Mugabe's 37-year reign? Sandra Gatman, the Newsmakers.
Let's go to our panel now. In Zimbabwe's capital, we have Bright Matonga. He was once Robert Mugabe's Deputy Information Minister. Also in Harare, we have former Finance Minister Tendai Biti. He was a member of the MDC and PDP opposition parties. Gentlemen, good to have you on the Newsmakers. Let me ask you, Bright Matonga, it looks like a coup, it sounds like a coup, so why isn't the military calling it a coup?
Look, you can call it a coup and whatever name you can give it. I think the most important thing for the people of Zimbabwe is that there's going to be a new dispensation by whatever means. But I'm happy to say that the process has been very smooth. They used soft power, they used persuasion, they used the constitution. They tried to reason with the president and his cabinet. They were not willing to listen to anybody. So constitutionally, the army had to give a warning and say, hey, whatever is happening within your party, it has to be resolved because it has got serious repercussions on the security of the country. And the army should not be found to be interfering in political affairs of the country. that was, they received a deaf ear, and majority of Zimbabweans are happy that something was done, something is being done, and it's good for the future of Zimbabwe. It's good for our relations. What I can assure you, and what I can tell you from Harare is that it's very peaceful for Zimbabweans, peaceful for foreigners. Airplanes are coming in and going out. Obviously, the situation has been very tense in the morning, but the most important thing is that there is going to be a new dawn for Zimbabwe.
Okay, well, we'll have to wait and see. Tendai Biti, I know you were a minister when it was a unity government, but you've built your entire career in the opposition, in opposition to Robert Mugabe. I'm assuming you must be a little bit torn here because Mugabe is on his way out, but it's a military coup. You can't really cheer a military coup, can you?
Well, I think that no one should ever celebrate a military coup because that is an invasion of the constitution. So there's no question about that. And so Zimbabweans, we are caught in this trepidation, in this ironic contradiction that we cannot celebrate a military coup, but at the same time we also know that the fundamental, the fundamentals on the ground which make protest and anger inevitable, and which make us view this coup or military action otherwise with a different lens, because people are suffering, people are unemployed. We've got this deep, huge structural crisis, which include an economic crisis, a political crisis, and something has to give in. We're on quicksand, and it's regrettable that a military coup has to manifest itself this way instead of the democratic citizen simply going into the ballot box and removing the government, as happens in every other decent, democratic, peace-loving country.
Mr. Biti, do you trust the military to usher in an era of democracy, to take you to the point where you have fresh elections and Zimbabweans can choose a new leader?
Yeah, armies are never designed for that. Armies are never designed to push political agendas. And I know that the gentlemen or ladies who are behind what is happening now also know that. So I think that at some stage there will have to be dialogue between international institutions, regional institutions like the SADC, the Southern African Development Corporation, like the African Union, and citizens, including the army, including opposition political parties, on how do we transit from the current situation of illegality to a situation where we restore the constitution. And there should be a roadmap on how we arrive at that destination where we can have a free and fair election and celebrate a free and fair election. Yes. I know the army would have thought, but it's not just going to be an electrocentric mindset. It can be an electrocentric mindset that we need to just to go to an election. There must also be an address of the fundamentals, the underlying fundamentals that have caused this kind of thing. Unless those are addressed before the election, then it doesn't matter whether we have an election 5 years or 10 years. We'll be faced with another situation where the military is forced to come out of the barrack to defend a certain idea, a certain value system, because we've not laid the sufficient foundation. So as a country, we are at a crossroads. Patience is required, tolerance is required, wisdom is required, but we are in a very fragile, very vulnerable position. It's so easy right now, even though there's been peace today, it's so easy for this thing to implode. It's so easy for a bloodbath to implode. I know that there's no unanimity in the army itself. I know that there is no unanimity between the army, the police, and the CIO. So we are really in no man's territory where the country can implode. I'm a student of Zimbabwean history. I know of no other point of vulnerability except in 1450 when the great Mwenemtaba died and which sparked the civil war for 50 years. I hope we don't go the route of 1450.
Okay, this is interesting. Bright Matonga, you said that you have no fears and it's a new dawn. Tendai Biti is saying, hold on. We're fragile right now. And looking at some of the facts on the ground, given that we see that among the youth wing of ZANU, some people are still loyal to Robert Mugabe, to Grace Mugabe. They're not happy with them being ushered out of power. Aren't you at least a little worried that things can spiral out of control?
You can only be positive. I know it's a very fragile period for everybody. There's been anger brewing for years. There's hunger. There's shortage of foreign currency. There's shortage of things are beginning to improve in terms of production of food. But really, there are no jobs. So really, there's a history of violence in the country. So all those issues have to be addressed. But it's a process. Let's hope that this transition period, obviously, it can't be rushed. They will assess the situation. There are arrests. People are going to be arrested who have been trying to hijack the democratic process. This is obviously a very fragile period for Zimbabwe. I'll be lying to say that the army is going to be, they will leave tomorrow to go back to the barracks. I think it would be very naive for anyone to think that way.
Right. Bright,
we just pray that they,
Bright, let me come in here. Let me ask you if you have any personal regrets, right? Because the problems didn't really start with Mugabe purging within ZANU. Yes, it's been happening. Mnangagwa was fired. There were inner purges. Obviously, something set off the army. It could be because Mugabe was preparing for his wife to be the next president. It's tough to know. But the problems didn't start with recent events. Mugabe has collapsed the economy in the past. He's stripped white farmers of their rights and kicked them off their land and so on. As somebody who's been a ZANU PF loyalist all your life and somebody who's worked for Mugabe, do you have any personal regrets that you helped shore up the man for so many years?
No, some of us, we spoke up. That's why we were fired. That's why we've been harassed. So I understand the opposition, where they're coming from. You know, when you're a spokesperson, you have to defend whether something is wrong or something is right. But you have to take a part position. I can't say I've got regrets. We trusted the man. He betrayed everybody. He betrayed his comrades. He betrayed the army. And I want to look forward. I want to be positive. I want to urge Zimbabweans. I want to urge everybody that at least we can have something that can involve everyone. We can't rush even for elections, because it can be the same thing again. We don't know what the army are thinking. We don't know how fast or how soon they're going, they will assess the situation and see that it is okay now. But for the coming week or two, obviously there is that process of trying to hunt for these former ministers, I would say them, who had hijacked the government, who had hijacked the president, and bring them to book. And they have to be answerable.
Right.
So let's give that process time.
Okay.
Let's give the army trust.
Certainly. Let me bring in Tendai Biti. I want to ask you, Tendai Biti, because as far as we understand, Mugabe is safe. He's under house arrest, essentially. That's what Jacob Zuma is saying, and he spoke to him. What do you want to happen to someone like Robert Mugabe? He's old. He's 93 years old. What do you want to happen to him, Tendai?
Look, I think that wherever President Mugabe is, I hope that his life can be preserved, and I hope that the peace that has characterized this process so far is maintained. I don't think that anyone deserves to lose life for a cause like this, and so I hope that there is no harm that comes to not just President Mugabe, but to any other Zimbabwean. But I also hope that President Mugabe, in his wisdom, should also recognize that these things are happening because there's been closure of political space for so many years. These things are happening because a narrow elite has monopolized the state power. These things are happening because the state has failed to deliver over a long period of time, over a period of 37 years. 95% of our people are unemployed. 82% of our people are living in extreme poverty, surviving on less than US 35 cents a day. We've got over 4 million people that are in their diaspora, who are largely economic refugees. 37 years after independence, less than 30% of our population has access to electricity. Less than 45% of our people have access to covered ablution facilities. So something has to give in. The ideal situation is that we should have a democratic transition where elections take place. But we have this situation now. And we have this situation, let's condemn it, but let's also understand that, as Bright says, the soldiers are not going into the barracks today. So let's see whether we can create an opportunity of laying the foundations of a sustainable Zimbabwe. And in this regard, the soldiers must open up dialogue with Zimbabweans, with the SADC, the African Union, and the UN Security Council. This is our roadmap of handing over to an elected civilian authority. And this roadmap will have the following signposts around electoral reform, around perhaps stabilizing the economy, around perhaps ensuring that the international community understands what is being tried to do. So it's not a time for slogans, it's a time for reflection, it's a time for introspection, it's a time for prayer, it's a time for thought leadership, which is one thing that has been missing in our country for the past 37 years. It's a time for vision, which is one thing that unfortunately President Mugabe was never blessed with.
Bright, Emmerson Mnangagwa's name has been floated as a possible interim president. Lots of rumors on Twitter, in the newspapers, everywhere. It's difficult to follow the truth in the past day or two coming out of Zimbabwe. But if he is chosen by the army as an interim president, would that be the right move?
Right now, as we speak, there is no official ZANU-PF Twitter account. There is no official ZANU-PF Skype. There is no official ZANU-PF Facebook account. So anything that you see on the wires is fake. Right now, the issue is never about Emmerson Mnangagwa. The issue is about the people of Zimbabwe. We have been suffering. Just like every one of us, we've been victims of our old system. So Mnangagwa was the latest victim. He was also fired. Yet he's been defending the president all his life. He was sentenced to death when he was an 18-year-old and served 10 years. And for the president or whoever was advising him to treat him that way, I think it pained everyone, all Zimbabweans, the international community. The people felt for Emmerson Mnangagwa. But this process of soft power transfer was never about an individual. Let's make it that very clear. Let's not even speculate as to say who is going to be interim president. Because right now we still have got President Mugabe. He hasn't been kicked out. He's still the president. So we want due process to take place. I know there are discussions going on with the generals and their commander-in-chief. And we hope that obviously there will be positive developments. But the most important thing for everybody is that this is a new Zimbabwe, where we have to relook at everything, the constitution, the way we do business, tolerance, all those things have to be put into consideration without putting individual names in place. So the transition process has to include the opposition, it has to include the church, civic organization. Everyone has to be a stakeholder so that we say, look, the past, the way we have been doing business, it's not good for everybody.
Right.
Some things worked, some things didn't. So we have to revisit a lot of things that we've been doing.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's, for some people, it's been unfathomable to think of a Zimbabwe without Mugabe. He's been in charge for more than 37 years as president. Some good times for a lot of people, some terrible times for many, especially in the latter years. This could be the moment where he loses power. At the moment, the military is in charge of the country. It's an uncertain, it's a confusing, and it's a hopeful time for a lot of Zimbabweans. Gentlemen, I thank you both for taking the time to talk to us on the Newsmakers. Looking forward to talking to both of you in the coming weeks and months as we follow the Zimbabwe story closely. Thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Coming up, Turkey buys an advanced missile system from Russia. Is Ankara moving towards Moscow and away from NATO? And are neo-Nazis gaining support in Poland? We explore what happened this past weekend in Warsaw. Welcome back to the Newsmakers. A new missile defense contract between Turkey and Russia seems a done deal, and it has some members of NATO worried. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan traveled to the Russian resort town of Sochi this week to meet with his Russian counterpart. He and Vladimir Putin had been at loggerheads after the Turkish military shot down a Russian fighter jet in 2015. But their relationship now seems essentially fully restored. And some are asking if it means Ankara is moving away from its alliance with Europe. Here's Yvette McCullough.
It's a time of tense relations between traditional allies. Threats at home and abroad. And with an ongoing war next door, is Turkey setting its sights on a deeper friendship with Russia? Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan met his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin in Sochi on Monday, the latest step towards fully restoring ties. Moscow and Ankara fell out over this, when Turkey shot down a Russian jet after it violated its airspace in November 2015. Russia responded by freezing diplomatic ties, imposing economic sanctions, and banning Russian tourists from coming here to Turkey. But in June 2016, President Erdogan extended an olive branch, expressing his condolences for the incident.
Хочу отметить в начале нашей встречи, что наши отношения можно считать восстановленными практически в полном объеме. Ülkelerimizin ve halklarımızın her alanda daha yakın ve güçlü işbirliği içinde olması noktasında iki tarafta hemfikir.
But how will seeking a closer relationship with Russia go down with Turkey's NATO allies? Turkey and Russia's relationship has increasingly involved a military element, recently cooperating on operations to create de-escalation zones in Syria. And now Turkey has agreed to a $2.4 billion deal to buy a long-range anti-aircraft missile system from Moscow. The S-400 can support multiple range intercept missiles, capable of destroying targets from 40 to 250 kilometres away. The US Patriot system supports just one interceptor missile with a range of 96 kilometres. But this deal has angered NATO members, in part because the S-400 won't work with other NATO systems. The NATO Military Committee chairman has said the principle of sovereignty operates when buying military equipment, but the countries are sovereign both when making a decision and when facing the consequences of that decision. How will Turkey's relationship with Russia impact its relationship with NATO? And will Ankara's desire to defend itself lead to more enhanced military ties with Moscow? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from London is Alexander Kocharov. He's a head researcher on Europe and former Soviet republics for IHS Markit, a financial services company. From Washington, D.C. is Nicholas Harras. He's a senior analyst at the Center for a New American Security. And with me here in the studio is Emre Erşen. He's a professor of international relations at Marmara University. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Emre Erşen, let me begin with you. Turkey and Russia coming closer together, has it been a natural gravitation or has it been hard work?
It has been hard work, actually, especially if we consider what happened between the two countries 2 years ago, the fighter jet crisis. Well, in the 2000s, the relations actually improved gradually and very deliberately. The two countries actually tried to make good neighbors out of each other. But the fighter jet crisis put an end to it. But now, actually, they are trying to repair that relationship. And more or less, they actually achieved it. And we can understand this from their dialogue in Syria. They're working very closely in Syria. The economic relations are improving. The S-400 deal that we talked about before is about to be finalized. So when you take a look at the map, the picture of Turkish-Russian relations, it's definitely on the right path. But of course, there are some significant disagreements as well.
Yeah, we'll be straddling a few of these things. So you mentioned Syria. You mentioned missiles. We're going to talk about NATO and general geopolitical trends and business as well. Nicholas Heras, is Turkey's turn towards Russia, Erdogan's turn closer to Putin, does that mean that it has to come at the expense of Turkey's relationship with the Europeans and the Americans?
I don't think so. I mean, particularly from the perspective of Washington, there has been a sense since the beginning of the Trump administration that there needs to be a condominium of sorts between all the different actors when it comes to the Syrian conflict in particular. And the engagement between Erdogan and Putin has been positive, particularly in the context of the Astana process, in trying to get a workable de-escalation zone scheme that can wind down the war in Syria and can work towards stability. I think the more thorny issue is, of course, the S-400 system, and that is going to be a much more difficult discussion, particularly in the context of NATO. But I would say from the view from Washington is any type of Turkish-Russian engagement in Syria is positive.
Okay, so let's talk about Syria for a moment. Alexander, given that Turkey and Russia talking and thrashing things out at Astana and elsewhere, it might be taking the sting out of the war in Syria, if not ending the war. Is that positive?
Well, you know, Russia has been involved in Syria for the past 2 years, and it sees its role as, it views its role in Syria as largely positive, with the significant removal of the Islamic State controlled areas from significant parts of the country. Turkey understands the dynamic very well, and it understands that it needs to be on the same side with Russia if it wants to achieve its own objectives in Syria. This is clearly has to deal with the Kurdish-controlled areas in the north and particularly northwest of the country. Turkey understands very well that in order to achieve its objectives, it needs to talk to Putin, to Russia, because Russia controls a lot of the situation on the ground in Syria.
Emre Erşen, does that suggest a kind of begrudging maturity in the Turkish approach to Syria, whereas a few years ago it was a bit more bullish about everything, whereas now it's going, okay, there's a list of possibly bad options, let's take the least bad option and work with the Russians, even though we disagree with the Russians fundamentally in terms of them backing Assad and so on. Is that a more pragmatic Turkish foreign policy on Syria?
Well, I think so, because, you know, we have to see the relationship between Turkey and Russia also in the light of Turkey's ongoing partnership with NATO and the West. And when it comes to that, Turkey also has significant problems with the United States currently. We know that. And when it comes to the YPG especially, because this is the major problem of Turkey in Syria, I think Turkey believes Russia is a much more pragmatic partner, especially in dealing with the YPG. So Turkey believes there is some room of improvement for to satisfies Turkey's needs when it comes to the YPG, especially if it continues this dialogue with Russia as well as Iran. And as we know, currently Turkey, Russia and Iran are actually cooperating in the region of Idlib. And Turkey's cooperation in Idlib is extremely important for both Moscow and Tehran. But Turkey's expectation at the same time is to extend this cooperation to Afrin, the region which is controlled by the YPG. And I think currently Turkey believes the cooperation with Russia and Iran is the best way to go. It's the most pragmatic or the realistic way to achieve these goals in Syria.
Yeah, interesting. Nicholas Heras, I live in Istanbul, and listening to Turkish people, they feel somewhat belittled by the Americans, especially when they hear the American justification, for example, in terms of arming the YPG, where the Americans say, well, you know what, we've given them the weapons and they've got serial numbers on them, they're going to give them back to us when it's all done, don't worry about it. That kind of thing is laughed at here, and maybe the Turks see the Russians as a better partner in a place like Syria. How's that going to go down in a place like Washington? Does it just diminish Washington's influence in the Middle East, whereas in the past other countries didn't have a choice, but now countries like Turkey have a choice in terms of who they deal with?
So the U.S. has consistently said that it views Turkey is having a strong role when it comes to winding down the conflict in Syria. And if we expand beyond Syria, Turkey, particularly in the realm of humanitarian assistance and other engagement, has been a very positive actor in the Horn of Africa, in the Arabian Peninsula, and in Libya, in North Africa, and other areas. If we go back to Syria, I mean, the U.S. has taken a region-by-region approach when it comes to the EPG and the wider Syrian Democratic Forces coalition. In the particular context of Afrin, where you have less U.S. connectivity with those particular constituent militias of the EPG, and you have a strong presence of Russia and the Assad government in northwest Syria, is of course natural that Turkey and Russia and Iran, to a lesser extent, would engage on the topic of the EPG and winding down the conflict there in northern and western Syria. In northern and eastern Syria, of course, the U.S. is going to be engaged with the Syrian Democratic Forces coalition, and my understanding is the Trump administration continues to seek to engage with Turkey on helping to build out the stabilization mission in areas west of the Euphrates River, in particular in the area of Raqqa, where Turkey can play a very positive role in rebuilding and reconstruction that city. And just one point on sort of U.S. influence on the ground, I think we have to keep in mind that right now the U.S. is directly in control or has strong influence over almost a third of Syrian territory. And Turkey, through its Euphrates Shield Zone and its potential zone in Idlib, could have a direct territorial control over an area of Syria larger than the size of the U.S. state of Delaware. So combined, the U.S. and Turkey have significant leverage on the ground in Syria, and that will have consequences not only for winding down the Syrian civil war, but for broader Middle East security.
Emre, do they still need each other, the U.S. and Turkey, when it comes to a place like Syria, even though Turkey's maybe finding it easier to do business with the likes of Russia?
Well, we're talking about two NATO partners currently, so I think militarily speaking, Turkey definitely wants to be closer to the United States and its traditional Western partners rather than Russia. Yes, Russia is a very important neighbor of Turkey, and when it comes to Syria, Turkey sees Russia as a much more influential power. But in the final analysis, we know that when it comes to the solution of the Syrian crisis, it's all about the dialogue going on between Washington and Moscow, and Turkey is aware of that.
But if Turkey wants to strengthen that NATO alliance, why, from the NATO perspective, is it thumbing its nose at its allies by purchasing those S-400 surface-to-air missiles? It's saying, we want to do business with the Russians, we're going to buy missiles from them, we don't care. You heard Petr Pavel, the head of NATO's military committee. He wasn't happy. General Mattis wasn't happy. Turkey's gone ahead with it anyway. So why is it doing that? Why is it sort of poking the NATO alliance by doing business with the Russians in terms of these missiles?
Well, I think in terms of this deal, I mean, the debate about the S-400 deal, we are talking about the technical details, and I believe that Turkey definitely needs to reinforce its national defense because it's such a volatile region. But I think the political implications of this deal are much more important currently than the technical details, and I believe Turkey is actually trying to give a deliberate message to its Western allies, and that it has other options. Because, as you know, when Turkey started its plans for developing its national missile defense system, it started a few years ago, and NATO and the NATO countries didn't really want to give that system to Turkey, or they didn't actually want to share their technology, or they were against the co-production. And I think by using this S-400 thing on the table, I mean, keeping it on the table is quite useful for Turkey in terms of its political dealings with NATO and the United States.
Right. Okay, so political victory. Alexander, is it a political victory for Vladimir Putin in creating more of a crack in the NATO alliance by selling these missiles to key NATO member Turkey?
Well, obviously, Russia views it as a very positive development because, you know, ideally the Kremlin would like to see NATO or the EU crumble, all these Western structures which Russia sees as views as very hostile towards Russia. So whatever they can do, even creating these little cracks, is something that would be viewed as a very positive development by Moscow. And this is exactly the reason why Putin feels drawn towards Erdogan. All the complexities in Turkey's recent relationship with the West obviously bringing these two men together.
Is there a fear, Nicholas, in Washington that the West is going to lose Turkey?
I don't get that sense. The sense that we have here in Washington is that although the sale of that missile system to Turkey by Russia is an irritant in the U.S., Turkish, and the broader Turkish-NATO relationship. The fact of the matter is that Turkey is a sovereign country, and it is part of NATO as a sovereign country. And there is an awareness here in Washington that although the U.S. and Turkey have had some troubles recently in the relationship continues to be strong. There's a lot of engagement, particularly in the economic and also in the cultural exchange realm. And that, you know, the U.S. has a mature perspective that Turkey also has to manage its relationship with its neighbors, whether it's Iran or whether it's Russia. And there could be some potential benefits for Turkey by keeping Vladimir Putin at bay, by throwing him a bone with the sale of the missile system.
Yeah, interesting point there, Emre. Do others not understand it well enough that Turkey has to live in this region and has to border the Syrians and the Iranians and be close to the Russians and so on? Because Nicholas mentioned that. He says there's an understanding that Turkey has to deal with its neighbors. Is there really an understanding, or has there been an understanding up until now?
Well, I think Turkey is a little bit disappointed about this issue when it comes to its debates with its Western allies. And I think the general belief in Turkey and the Turkish government and also the Turkish public is that so far the Western allies have failed to appreciate Turkey's position in this region. Turkey is living in a very hard region, and of course it has to have a special relationship with Russia, especially after the military intervention of Russia back in 2015. But I think the thing here is to keep the dialogue channels open, because when they are closed, I think in Turkey's case, Turkey knows that it has to deal with both Russia and its NATO partners at the same time. So that dialogue is very important. And from time to time, I think there are significant misunderstandings, especially in the Turkish public, about the United States perceptions about the situation in Syria and also the Turkish national security interests there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so as we step back and we look at everything with a bird's eye view, we look at trade, we look at security, we look at the geography and the geopolitics. Alexander, when you look at Turkey and Russia, who do you think needs whom more?
I think, you know, both countries are tactically required to have this relationship, while strategically they can be easily viewed as regional competitors, because both are fundamentally regional powers who are vying for more influence in the region. They need this relationship because they both depend on trade and economic issues. Russia needs a market for its energy. It wants to sell more gas to Turkey and via Turkey to Europe. It needs a market for its nuclear technology, and it's very interested in completion of the project in Turkey. But also Turkey needs a market for its agribusiness. It needs a market for its tourism industry, and Russia can provide these markets. So it is a mutually beneficial relationship, which from the economic standpoint makes a lot of sense. And this is what we see. There is a lot of pragmatism in this relationship recently.
Emre, do you agree with that? They both need each other equally?
I think they do currently. I mean, yes, we talk about all these economic relations, energy, and etc., but there's also a very significant geopolitical aspect of it, and Syria is only one dimension of that. And we can also talk about the cooperation in the Black Sea, which is extremely important for Russia, at least. Yes, Syria currently is equally important for both of them, but when it comes to Black Sea, when it comes to the Caucasus, the two countries are quite influential regional players, and I think they both saw this, and they took this lesson after the fighter jet crisis. During the period when the relations were completely suspended, I think both Russia and Turkey understood that they need each other when it comes to regional issues, apart from all these very significant economic links, energy, tourism, and etc.
Nicholas, not just the Turks, not just the Russians, maybe the Iranians, maybe the Saudis and so on. Are we going to see all of these countries become a bit more proactive in the years to come? Because it might be that Washington is untangling itself, extricating itself from the region?
There is definitely a movement towards all these various regional actors taking a unilateral approach to their policies in the Middle East and its near abroad. I would say, though, that the U.S. continues to maintain a very strong force presence in the Gulf, and the U.S. continues to maintain its strategic alliances with various different actors in the region, particularly Turkey, and you could see an expansion of the U.S. presence, in fact, in Syria. and a presence that lasts for years to come. So rather than say that the U.S. is sort of withdrawing itself from the region, what I would say is that the U.S. is now in a reality where there's a multipolar dynamic. And the U.S. Is best served as sort of serving as a coordinating actor where all these different actors circle around.
Okay. Gentlemen, it's been good to have the conversation. Nicholas Harras, Alexander Kocherov, and Emre Erşen. I thank you all for joining us on the Newsmakers. Independence Day in Poland. It's meant to be a celebration of the country's return to sovereignty at the end of World War I. But a rally at this year's commemoration ended in violence. Nationalists clashed with police, attacked the Russian embassy, and burned down a pro-LGBT display. But the scenes that really stunned the world were the images of red flares burning while a crowd chanted for God, honor, and fatherland. Their slogans common during neo-Nazi marches. It's left us wondering, how can a country that suffered under the Third Reich find itself in this kind of political climate? Here's Shoaib Hassan.
They say they are marching to protect their national identity. Thousands turned out on Poland's National Day.
We have our own country, and we want to govern our country as we please. Western Europe is not going to govern here and decide for us. We want to remain Polish and not European.
But it wasn't just Euroscepticism on display. Many demonstrators chanted anti-refugee and anti-Islamic slogans and called for what they said was a clean Poland, a white Poland. It's an agenda that members of the country's ruling right-wing Law and Justice Party also seem to have taken up.
Opowiadamy się za wspólnotą, w której chrześcijańskie tradycje nie są przedmiotem ideologicznej cenzury. Chrześcijanie w Europie nie mogą odczuwać dyskomfortu, wstydzić się swojej wiary i tradycji.
The Prime Minister made the remarks at an EU meeting where she emphasized her party's opposition to Muslim immigrants. Human rights groups say her government has been able to implement such policies due to its crippling of the courts.
They have identified 7 key areas. I think the most important ones, all of them are equally important, but primarily we're talking about interference with the independence of the judiciary.
Rights groups say the only remaining check on the government's authority is civil society groups and activists. Like these people, marching in the memory of activist Piotr Cicheshny. Cicheshny burnt himself to death near a national landmark in capital Warsaw last month. It was to protest what he said was the increasing authoritarianism of the ruling party. The Poles marching here say they stand by his principles and want a government that can be held accountable. Their numbers are small though, while those of the nationalists are growing. Polarizing Poland, will their increasing numbers push the conservative government further to the right? Shoaib Hassan, the Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Warsaw is Marek Matraszczak. He's a political commentator in Poland and the chairman of the CEC, a conservative public affairs agency. Thanks so much for joining us, Marek. We were all very surprised by some of the slogans that came out of that rally.
Thank you very much.
And when I look at some of those slogans, pure blood, clear mind, Europe will be white or uninhabited, white Europe of brotherly nations, pray for Islamic Holocaust. Do you find any of that acceptable?
Well, first of all, I think, say the Islamic Holocaust banner was not at that demonstration. It was up 2 years ago. That's not to say that this demonstration didn't happen, but I think it's very important to put it into context. This was a very small group of demonstrators within a larger crowd. This was the annual Independence Day march, which Poland holds every 11th of November in celebration of independence in 1918. And this demonstration, as in previous years, was effectively infiltrated by a smaller group of quite radical demonstrators. But this has happened every year. And it's very important to understand that these slogans, which were regrettable and were in fact condemned very strongly by both the Polish president, the Polish prime minister, they have very little traction in the electorate as a whole. This was a very small vocal group in a very large demonstration on a national day, and it's unfortunate, but it should be put into context.
Yeah, and that's what we want to do. I'm curious, though, if it's that small and that marginal, why is President Duda even condemning it? If it's that unimportant, if he's coming out and saying there's no place in the country for anti-Semitism, there's no place for xenophobia and what he calls sick nationalism, it obviously had an impact if among the 60,000 people, it was big enough for the president to come out and need to condemn it.
Well, it was the right thing to do. I think the president, I think it's clear that the Polish president has an obligation to condemn even marginal acts which cause concern. And because this demonstration received such large coverage in the Western media, and it was very heavily reported and still is being reported, I think he was as much addressing the foreign audience who were clearly and rightly concerned to reassure them that as far as the Polish government, the Polish authorities, the Polish president are concerned, this was a marginal event which obviously has to be condemned in the strongest possible terms. So I think that was his motivation there.
Yeah, I want to call up some images from 2013. So you have the Independence Day rally. Yes, it's filled with nationalism. A lot of people proud of their country, proud of their independence. A lot of symbols that are clearly right-wing, but nothing tipping over into kind of the neo-Nazi category, right? So it's clear it's a celebration and a lot of people on the right there. Compared to 4 years later and this past weekend, we're suddenly seeing the red torches. We're seeing these symbols that tend to evoke a lot of fear amongst other people. It reminds me a lot of, I guess, the burning crosses in the United States from the KKK. Do you believe that there's a deliberate attempt from those that you feel have infiltrated in order to create that sense of fear to this international audience that you're talking about? Don't come to Poland. We don't want refugees. We don't want immigrants. And we hate you because we want to be pure.
Well, I think this is you've seen this across Europe. I think Europe today is very different from where it was 4 years ago. And of course, 4 years ago, Europe didn't have the challenge that it had for migrants that it has today. And these radical demonstrators have appeared not just in Poland. They've been in demonstrations in Italy, in France, in Germany, even in the UK. It's a radical shift, it's true. But it's really because of the external challenges that Europe has faced over the last 4 years. I wouldn't connect it to the current government. And at the same time, of course, I think it's also important to understand that alongside these right-wing demonstrators in Poland over the weekend, you also had quite a number of quite extreme left-wing demonstrators. So we have a problem which is polarization.
Right.
And as in all these cases, it's very easy for a very small minority to look more impressive than it really is.
Interestingly, it was the counter-demonstrations who featured arrests. So we only had arrests from the counter-demonstrations, not from the main demonstrators. But, I mean, you've said the context is the external factors, right? The migration crisis and so on. Who's misinforming these people? When you look at the population of Poland, 38 million people, and the number of asylum seekers that have come in since the migrant crisis began is slightly more than 1,400. Now, that's nothing. It's a drop in the ocean when you look at the population of 38 million, and only 18 have come from Syria. So this doesn't impact Polish society at all. Who's misinforming these people to make them think that their way of life is under threat from these migrants or by these migrants? Who's telling them that?
Well, it's not for me to defend what I agree are very extreme slogans, and I think you should invite a member of these groups to explain their motivation. But I think what you're seeing in Poland is also a fear, perhaps, that there are moves by the European Union, as we know, to encourage the transfer of migrants into other member states. And frankly, there is a popular sentiment in Poland that this is undesirable. And that's a very broad sentiment, which is reflected in the general opinion polls. I don't think that's a secret. But that's very different from some of the very unpleasant, nasty, and aggressive slogans that were on display those reflect a tiny minority of the population. The vast majority of the Poles, Polish people, I think, just want to see Poland as it is today. And I think that's a point of view which is very popular in the country right now.
These aggressive expressions of the far right, not just the right, but the very far right, when you have Nazi symbols, for example, for an international audience in the English language who are watching this, they want to know, is this representative at all of a shift in Polish society? Is Polish society going in that direction?
There's absolutely no shift in Polish society. If you look at the opinion polls, you'll see that any of these very extreme right-wing proto-fascist parties have 0% support in the opinion polls. There's no political challenge from them. They're not in parliament. They don't even register in the opinion polls. This is a very, very vocal minority. And I think for people in the West to say that Poland, of all countries which suffered horribly under the Second World War, under Nazism, to think that there is any sense of any revival of fascist ideology in Poland is frankly ridiculous. And I think you only have to look at the efforts that are being made on a cross-party basis in Poland, the government and the opposition, to maintain excellent relations with Israel, to commemorate the Holocaust, to play their role in underlining Poland's suffering in the Second World War. These are all cross-party consensus issues, and there's no political traction behind these extremists, no more traction than you would have behind, say, the English Defence League in the United Kingdom, some of the more extreme right-wing parties in Germany or Italy, getting very little traction. In fact, there's less political traction for these sort of right-wing movements in Poland than there are in other EU countries, such as Italy or Germany, where you do have parties in mainstream politics very closely aligned to these groups. That's not the case in Poland.
Marek Matraszek, I thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, Catalonia's Carles Puigdemont fights extradition. But will the separatist leader get a fair trial in Spain? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.